Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Understanding Ideal's Program Improvement Award. This webinar is organized by the Implementer-led Design, Evidence, Analysis, and Learning, or IDEAL activity. Funded by USAID's Office of Food for Peace, IDEAL works to support the United States government's goal of improving food and nutrition security among the world's most vulnerable communities and households. Before we begin, I would like to encourage all attendees to post their questions in the Q&A box during the webinar, as opposed to the chat box. And then all questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So to begin, I would like to introduce today's speakers. My name is Kim Jerzyk. I am the Senior Communications Coordinator for the IDEAL activity, and I will be moderating today's webinar. We also have Austin Musso, who is our Small Grants Manager, who will be talking about the Program Improvement Award. We also have Laura Zilmer, our M&E Specialist, who will talk about the PIA, who will talk about the TOPS Program Improvement Award, and Deanna Picon, our Resilience and Adaptive Management Specialist. So now, just to really quickly go over the agenda for the webinar. First, we'll hear from Austin Musso, who will talk about the Program Improvement Award and the application process, and also give a really brief overview of the Small Grants Program and any differences you'll see from the Program Improvement Award versus the microgrants. We'll then hear from Laura Zilmer. We'll hear examples of the TOPS Program Improvement Awards. We'll then explore the content focus areas that are mentioned in the Program Improvement Award. We'll go over recommendations for the Program Improvement Award during the application process. And finally, we will end the webinar with a Q&A session. So now I'd like to turn it over to Austin Musso, our Small Grants Manager, to talk about the Small Grants Program for IDEAL. Austin?
Good morning, everyone. We're so glad you could be here with us. I know many of you were not able to join us for the July webinar, which focused on the Small Grants Program as it was first launched. So I wanted to give you a brief overview of the IDEAL Small Grants Program objectives to help frame our conversation. We're striving to facilitate the creation and dissemination of new tools and best practices throughout both the emergency and development communities with the overall goal of improving food security program outcomes. We believe that we can support implementing partners through these awards to conduct applied research, test innovative approaches, and organize knowledge sharing events. And these can help us generate really applicable learnings for the larger community that can push the needle forward and improve those food security outcomes. This is being done through our microgrants, which are the $50,000 award. The first microgrant RFA was released in July, and many of you know is still open for applications. The second mechanism is the Program Improvement Award, which we'll be highlighting today. And the third mechanism used is the Research Award, which we're hoping to release in 2020. All three of these mechanisms will focus on advancing learning, particularly related to the 7 content focus areas under IDEAL. Next slide, please. So many of you joined us today to learn about the Program Improvement Awards and really figure out if your project idea is a best fit for a PIA or for a microgrant. So I want to spend a few minutes highlighting the differences. The truth is the overall goals of the microgrant and PIA and Program Improvement Award are the same as we just discussed in the last slide, to generate learning and knowledge for the larger community. But there are very different mechanisms and have very different accompanying regulations to accomplish those goals. So one mechanism might be better suited for some organizations, and certain projects might be better suited for one mechanism than another. So the obvious difference when you look here is the amount of funding. This enhanced funding level of $100,000 will allow for more ambitious ideas, both in the terms of scope of the project envisioned and the strategies pursued. So that's to say that you can answer more complex questions and have a wider array of project types and investigative tools can be used. In the microgrant, we really directed and said, we think primarily tool development and knowledge sharing events can be done really well for $100,000, for the $50,000 microgrant. For a $100,000 Program Improvement Award, we think that really opens up the, opens up your repertoire for different types of projects, and we're excited to see what you propose. We also, under this award with $100,000, will be awarding cost reimbursable grants, whereas the micro grants were fixed amount awards. So a program improvement award, you need to have the ability to manage finances appropriately with USAID rules and regulations and ensure that all the costs and all the expenses are allowable. So I think it's important to note that if you don't have USAID experience, have not worked extensively with recording those and submitting financial reports in the past, the micro grant might be a better fit for your organization. The other item when we thought about these two award types is we're specifically looking for learnings in the Program Improvement Award, which are aligning with the Food for Peace learning agenda, as well as the Food for Peace strategy. The learning agenda was just released this past month, and we feel that with $100,000, we really want to make sure these are aligned, whereas the micro grant had kind of broader contributions to the food security community as the overall objective. Another item that makes the Program Improvement Award distinct is that dissemination should be targeted towards those key stakeholders in the international food security community, especially Food for Peace and OFDA implementers. And as you would expect, with a $100,000 award, there are going to be heightened reporting requirements, not only the quarterly financial reporting, which is required with a cost reimbursable award, but also quarterly program narrative reporting, giving us an update on where you are in your work plan, what are some of the monitoring outcomes you're seeing thus far, and how is it going overall? And we can provide updates and provide technical support during that process. The last difference that you'll notice when applying is there's actually a two-stage application process, and I'm going to be discussing that in the next slide. So the Program Improvement Award is taking from what we did under TOPS, and the TOPS found that by having a two-stage application process, we can make it much easier for all types of organizations to apply without having to have a major commitment to a 10-page or 20-page application right up front. So instead, we have a 5-page concept note template that has been designed and is shared with the RFA that we're asking everyone to submit by the assigned deadline. That concept note template is really asking for high-level information, project goals, what are the major interventions, what are the ideal contributions, how does it align with the Food for Peace strategy and learning agenda, and a very basic budget outline, but is not going into the weeds. That's going to be in the full application where you're really going to go into the detail. Once you submit your concept note, we'll have a technical review panel here in Ideal that is going to score that application, and concept notes that score above this set threshold will be invited to submit the full application. They'll also receive some recommendations from Ideal technical reviewers on areas where we think you could really improve and strengthen your application when you submit the full application package. That full application package is comprised of a up to 10-page narrative document describing how you're going to implement it, including a monitoring plan and the dissemination activities that you're going to be utilizing. It also includes separate budget and budget narrative documents, a 12-month work plan in Excel, as well as a short document requesting background information on 2 recent projects and the donors that you worked with on those projects. Again, to help us understand that you can meet these USAID rules and regulations, particularly related to finance. So these scoring criteria are all in the RFA now, so I'd encourage you to think about both the concept note and full application when you're deciding if this is the right award mechanism for you. They can be found in sections E and sections F. Because we have this process, the Program Improvement Awards, we're expecting the award timeline will be approximately 4 to 6 months from the first deadline. So if you submit in October, in the October deadline, we're expecting approximately 4 to 6 months before the sub-awards will be made. So I think that's an important timeline and an estimate at that to think about when you're planning your project and make sure that that would align with what your overall objectives were and how it's aligning with other projects in that specific country. Next slide, please. We just spoke briefly about timelines. The first timeline that's coming up is the question and answer period. We are accepting questions from the audience, which we're going to answer and then put up on the website until October 8th. So any questions that are asked during this webinar, as well as anything that comes in through the ideal_PIA@savethechildren.org email address will be answered. And then the feedback is going to be posted on the website. So everyone will have access to those answers ahead of the October 25th deadline. So again, these deadlines are just for the 5-page concept note, not full application. You only have to submit one thing, which is that concept note. The second deadline is then set for Friday, December 13th. And that second deadline means that if you don't submit by October 25th, everything after October 25th will be reviewed starting on December 13th. We follow a similar process in the microgrant, so I believe most of you will be familiar with that. Next slide, please. When deciding if the ideal grant is the right funding source for the project you have in mind, I would recommend visiting section B2 in the RFA. If your project fits the guidelines that are laid out here, that's a really good first step and says, great, this might be the right funding source. If you're looking at this description and thinking it really doesn't align with what I'm trying to do or what we think we're going to create, then maybe a different funding source would be more appropriate for you. So I'm just going to read it out, and we've highlighted a few sections that we think are key. These projects will address a gap in knowledge or skill capacity that is of importance to the larger food and nutrition security implementing partner community. Successful applications will demonstrate the potential to build capacity within and beyond the implementing organization and generate significant knowledge related to one or two of IDEAL's content focus areas and the ideal and the Food for Peace strategy and Food for Peace learning agenda. So again, good to check on this as you're thinking about, is this the right thing for me to apply for? Next slide, please. A few other last items that I want to call out from the Program Improvement Award RFA. In section B3, we did provide a few examples of types of Program Improvement Awards that could be done, and we've seen done under TOPS, for example. Some things that have been done with $100,000 and could be encouraged as project types are piloting of promising practices, evaluating projects and data sets to fill a gap in evidence, developing guidance or e-learning courses, even developing a tool such as a training of trainers curriculum, which can increase the capacity beyond just one organization, could be really valuable contributions to the larger food security community. Again, we're keeping these very broad. This is not an inclusive list, so we look forward to what project ideas you bring forward for using this $100,000. The eligibility criteria then that are highlighted in section C are also very broad. We want to, again, welcome the whole implementing community to apply for these awards. We're looking for NGOs, for-profit organizations, even institutions of higher education to submit applications. We have, the expectation is just that they have completed all the required steps with the host government to legally operate their program in the target country. You do not need to have specifically USAID experience to apply for these awards, but it's highly recommended, as the expectation will be, that you can account for USAID finances and submit the appropriate reporting to meet those standards. With the Program Improvement Award, a no cost share is required. It is welcome and can be incorporated, but it is by no means required and is not part of the scoring criteria. We also wanted to call out that organizations can apply for more than one Program Improvement Award. We are not restricting that at this time, but IDEAL will continue to evaluate how our resources are reaching a wide variety of the implementing partner community as we move forward with these RFAs. And then lastly, around eligibility, there was a question that came in regarding sole proprietorships and if they would be eligible. And we've spoken with our team here, our grants and contracts team, and based on what is written in the RFA, sole proprietorships would not be eligible to apply for Program Improvement Awards or microgrants at this time. The last item then on here is section E4 that I want to call out, is the encouraging of multi-stakeholder involvement. So we really believe at IDEAL that collaboration between implementing organizations and sharing knowledge is a core value and something that helps us get to those food security outcomes and helps us do better work. So we're encouraging that through these awards, especially when it comes to local partners. So you'll see that called out as the scoring criteria in the concept note. We're not going to dictate how, when, and where other stakeholders are involved, but we would like to see more collaborative efforts that are involving multiple stakeholders in these larger $100,000 awards. Now, I'd like to hand it over to our first guest speaker today, Laura Zilmer, who is our Monitoring Evaluation Specialist with IDEAL, and she's going to speak about the TOPS grantees and how they use the Program Improvement Awards.
Thanks, Austin, and good morning, everyone. As Austin mentioned, I now sit on the monitoring and evaluation team on IDEAL, but prior to this position, I served as the Small Grants Coordinator for the Small Grants Program under TOPS. So for those of you who are not familiar with TOPS, TOPS was in many ways the precursor to IDEAL. Like IDEAL, it was funded by Food for Peace. It was a learning mechanism with the goal to generate, capture, and share knowledge and promising practices in development food assistance programming. And like the Ideal Small Grants Program, the TOP Small Grants Program offered two types of small grants, micro grants and PIAs. And so over the course of 5 years, we awarded 21 PIAs to 20 different organizations in 14 countries, totaling around almost $2 million. So I wanted to provide a couple examples of some PIAs that were funded under the TOPS program, one of which was this Developing Guidelines to Improve Agriculture Demo Sites. So this was a grant that we funded to World Vision. We know that demo sites can be an important tool for farmers to learn firsthand about how to improve farming practices, and that while well-managed demo sites can help convince farmers to adopt proven practices, poorly presented demo plots can sometimes dissuade farmers from adopting new practices. And so World Vision recognized kind of prior to this award, there was sort of limited empirical evidence regarding factors that make a successful demo plot. So they conducted a literature review and collected data at demo plots in Bangladesh, Niger, Zimbabwe. They validated these findings with their program staff, and then they ultimately created these guidelines to serve as a tool for effective management of demo sites. And they presented these guidelines through a webinar at the TOPS annual Global Knowledge Sharing meeting, and they were also disseminated through the FSN network. Another example is this project, Increasing Numeracy in Rural Communities in Karamoja, Uganda. This was a grant funded to Ugandan NGO Agritech Talk, and they had identified low numeracy literacy as one of the greatest impediments to improved farming practices amongst smallholder farmers in Karamoja, Uganda. So they developed these animated modules that featured a cartoon extension agent that provided storylines for the development of numeracy skills specific to smallholder farmers. So topics included things like crop assessment, storage, bookkeeping, farm management, and then they established these numeracy clubs to promote the lessons, these lessons through peer-to-peer informal training, actually in partnership with Mercy Corps colleagues also in Uganda. And then materials and the lessons learned from these projects were posted online. They were provided to USAID's Monitoring and Evaluation Unit in Kampala upon request for distribution to other USAID projects. And they were also introduced at the FAO Food Security Cluster meeting in Nairobi. So these two projects are just some examples of what can be accomplished with a PIA. They're not necessarily meant to illustrate exactly the types of projects we would fund insofar as technical areas or sectoral areas. But I think what made these projects successful was that there was a capacity gap that was recognized, and then these organizations worked to fill that gap and then disseminate the products and learnings widely amongst the food security and nutrition community. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. Now that everyone has gotten a little bit more detail on the Program Improvement Award, I want to take a quick break from our normal presentation to hear from the audience. We're going to do a short live polling exercise to get to know the audience that's joining us today. And so I'm going to put up the first question on the screen, read it, and give you 60 seconds to respond, and then show the results. There's no right or wrong answers with these, and as you can see, we started with an easy, straightforward question. So we're asking, what type of work are you currently focused on? Development, emergency or humanitarian, or both? Please make your selections now. All right, it looks like we are sharing the polling results, and we have most people have submitted some insight. Thank you very much. Kind of as we'd expect, actually. We got a little heavier on the development side, but excited to see both humanitarian and emergency folks joining as well. As many of you may know, the TOPS program, which Laura mentioned, was primarily focused on the development food security community. So IDEAL is unique in that it's actually working with both development and the emergency communities and trying to really explore that development and emergency nexus. So we're excited to be making connections with more emergency programs, the EFSPs especially, and hope to continue to engage more emergency partners in the future. So let's skip to the next question. So which of IDEAL's content focus areas are you most likely to engage with? And we'll be discussing the content areas shortly, but they are strengthening the quality and impact of emergency programming, data collection and analysis for improved program design and impact, adaptive management and application of learning, integrated activity design and implementation, sustainability and planning for an exit, social and behavior change, or the final one, which is equity, empowerment, social cohesion, and social accountability. Take a few seconds, got plenty of time. Love to hear what you're most interested in from the content focus areas. All right, we're going to be wrapping up in just a few seconds. So if you haven't put in a vote, please do so now. Interesting. This is actually the first time we've asked this question, and it's exciting to see where people, if you had to select one, integrated activity design and implementation. And lucky for you, that is going to be the focus of the next presentation with Deanna Picon. She's going to focus on both integrated activity design implementation, as well as sustainability and planning for an exit. So you guys will have a sneak peek at kind of where are the learning gaps and what are we trying to focus on in these areas. But great to see there's a diversity throughout. We think that there's gaps in knowledge related to each of these content areas, and they're of high importance for the Food for Peace community. So glad to see that each organization is focused on a little variety of potential project types. I'm going to have the third and final question. Third question is, what types of knowledge generation or capacity building activities are you considering for a program improvement award? And in this case, you have multiple choices you can make. You don't have to select just one. Some of these examples we provided are piloting a promising practice, evaluating a current project or recent data set, developing guidance, TOT curriculum, e-learning courses, or other capacity building tools. Perhaps you're interested in scaling up a project after the initial pilot with our $100,000 award, or coordinating a knowledge sharing and capacity building event, and conducting research even can be done, depending on what type of research, of course. So please take a moment, I'll give you about 30 seconds to vote just on what you're thinking that you would like to use the Program Improvement Award for. Sharing the results. Wonderful. We have 34 votes and a lot of developing guidance, e-learning courses, building capacity tools, and that is great. We recognize that microgrants focused on tools, but program improvement awards can also develop tools. Sometimes there's tools that are more complex and will require a $100,000 budget to fully develop, such as an e-learning course. Piloting of promising practices, that's another common one we would tend to expect for using these. I think whenever you're piloting a promising practice, you just want to focus on the learnings from that pilot being mostly around the content focus area. So if the pilot does introduce agriculture, it shouldn't be learning about agriculture, but hopefully learning about behavior change in agriculture, or the sustainability aspects of agriculture, or integrated project design in agriculture. Really excited to see how these different projects will come in and over the next few months. So Thank you, Kim. So we really appreciate your input and excited to see the applications you choose to submit. I'm going to now hand over the mic to Deanna Picon, who is going to take a closer look at 2 of our ideal content focus areas.
Thank you, Austin. I think I'm very lucky that that you guys chose those 2 areas as the ones that you really want to engage the most with in IDEAL, and it's your lucky day. So I'll speak about these 2 areas, even though there are 7 areas in which IDEAL focuses their work. Food for Peace has identified these as key in improving food security outcomes of implementing partner programs. So the 2 I will speak of today are integrated activity design and implementation, and sustainability and planning for exit. IDEAL recently conducted a survey of development and emergency food security activities, where we asked them about the importance and urgency of each of IDEAL's areas, and to tell us more about what their needs are around them. For integrated design and implementation, a vast majority of those who responded to the survey felt that this area was important. But most of them did not feel it was urgent. For sustainability and planning for exit, the majority of development activity respondents felt it was both important and urgent. All respondents from emergency activities thought this area was important, but split halfway on whether it was urgent. This to me is remarkable. Even with the tight program implementation timelines and the nature of protracted crisis, they're still thinking of this connection with sustainability. So I'm here to explain a bit what we mean by these 2 areas, what the activities we surveyed have told us, and hopefully shed a bit of light on what are those key questions that we are hoping the Small Grants Program will help us answer or move the needle on, so to speak. Next slide, please. If you're passionate about integration, or even if it is a mystery to you, you probably have read the resource package for integrated development written by FHI 360. I really like the definition of integrated programming in it, an intentional approach that links the design, delivery, and evaluation of programs across sectors to produce an amplified, lasting impact on people's lives. Food for Peace activities are complex, multi-sectoral, and multi-layered, but this doesn't mean they are necessarily integrated. How many of us have worked in a context where we have one approach to targeting, but a different organization working in the same area with complementary activities we are depending on is targeting using a different approach? Or how many of us have started to implement without understanding the root causes of problems, instead moving on with pre-identified solutions? These are examples of where we need to increase our know-how and improve our application of in-food security programming. And why do I have the much maligned theory of change here? Because development food security activities must develop then, and if done properly, they can be the first step in the design of a sequenced, layered, and ultimately integrated program. However, once our programs start, we are in a rush to implement our work plans, and in so doing, we forget to look around us to make sure we know what other internal and external actors are doing in our space. I haven't forgotten about emergency activities. Implementing partners have shared with us their questions around complementary interventions. For example, how to make the most efficient use, the lack of guidance in linking and strategically program complementary activities with food assistance, and how to monitor and evaluate the impact of complementary activities, especially in protracted crisis. The Food for Peace learning agenda, which Austin shared with you earlier, is clear around some of the areas where we need some innovative examples and more know-how to tackle collaborative targeting, sequencing, effective programming, in general implementation. At the core of sustainability is the following question. How do we improve the sustainability or durability, resilience of the impacts achieved by our programs beyond their life cycle? It's at the heart of USAID's journey to self-reliance, and it is important to know that the expectation of an exit or sustainability plan is not how you will hand over the entire set of project interventions to a local provider. Rather, it is about how you transition key aspects of your intervention, the model you will use to deliver sustainable interventions, or testing innovative approaches that you think will improve the sustainability of an intervention. If you haven't seen this chart before, I have another link for you, the FANTAS study, referenced here, which the link will be shared with you momentarily, determined 4 key areas in their framework for sustained impact: a sustained source of resources, sustained technical and managerial capacity so that service providers can operate independently of the project, sustained motivation of program participants and service providers that does not rely on program inputs, and linkages to entities that can augment resources, refresh capacity, and motivate frontline service providers and participants to provide and make use of services and continue project-promoted practices. Now, this study has been used at Food for Peace and by several implementing partners to better understand and apply sustainability and planning for exit. But many of you have told us that so much depends on context, that each of these areas may look different in different contexts. Questions that our implementing partners and USAID are trying to answer include: how does a sustainable design affect service delivery models and how we monitor and evaluate them? How can we engage with local structures to hand over deliverables? Or even better, how do we engage with them from the start so there is no quote unquote handover at all? How do we engage with the programs around us to sequence and layer in the most effective way to sustain behaviors and service utilization? How are we engaging in strengthening the capacity of local partners, governments, and private sector? As mentioned earlier, one of the key concerns is how to start thinking about sustainability from day one. This slide shows a recent matrix developed by IDEAL and USAID, and that can be found in the link being shared right now. It takes the FANTA study conclusions and aims to make implementers start thinking at design what will be needed for interventions to be sustainable. It is part of a packet of theory of change training that IDEAL is making available online. Please feel free to use it, tweak it, and let us know if it is useful. For those of you engaged in emergency programming, you're also very concerned about sustainability. We've heard about your concerns around building resilience capacities during your programming, your questions around models for building capacity of local partners for rapid transitions, ensuring the continuation of support when short emergency programs end, in addition to finding the best models to reduce continued dependence on food assistance at a project's end. Capacity building of and coordination with local structures is brought up consistently in the list of your concerns, and in areas where these are areas where we're yearning for examples and know-how. For those of you especially interested in this, I want to leave you with an additional resource, the USAID Policy and Guidance on Resilience in Protracted Crisis. And we're going to be sharing that link right now. Finally, none of our content areas exist on their own. When talking about how to sustain our programs, we can't do that without talking about integrated design and implementation that continuously monitors how we are addressing equity, empowerment, and social behavior change at different levels. In order to do that, you need to have good data collection, analysis, and interpretation that is iterative and that allows you to apply learning and adapt continuously. Finally, it is evident by our talks with implementing partners that these are issues that affect both development and emergency actors. However, I do want to give you a word of caution. Make sure that when you're writing your proposals, you're clear about how they relate to a CFA, a content focus area. Failure to properly explain the connection will only be confusing to the reviewer. We are concerned with gaining knowledge on 1 or 2 specific content focus areas. Do not try to do that too much with one grant. And likewise, we're not looking for you to add an area component to an already existing intervention to participate in the small grant program. It needs to be already a part of the integral design of your intervention and knowledge you can share around an area you're already working on. Thank you very much, and I'll pass the baton to my colleague, Austin Musso.
Thank you, Diana, for diving into those 2 content focus areas. As a reminder, we had an in-depth look at 3 other content focus areas, which were adaptive management, data collection and analysis, and equity, empowerment, social cohesion, and social accountability during our July webinar. So if you want more information on those 3 content focus areas, you can watch a recording of the webinar, which is posted on YouTube, and a link is going to be provided shortly in the chat box. Now, before we open it up for question and answers, and we'll have plenty of time for that with our presentation, I wanted to just give a few last recommendations to think about with your concept note as you're preparing to submit one of these. This obviously, should be very, make a lot of sense after listening to the whole presentation. Project must generate applicable knowledge and learning. And Knowledge and learning is a core principle for the Ideal Award and the primary focus of our small grants. When many people see a RFA or a grant funding opportunity, they often think, though, about implementation and capacity building in their organization, or how can they improve the health and livelihoods of their community. We understand that. With these awards, those are secondary objectives. The primary objective and focus, which we're going to be looking for to be called out in the concept note especially, is, are you generating broader knowledge and learnings for the food security and nutrition community? And we want to ensure that knowledge is applicable to multiple implementers in multiple countries, especially organizations that are implementing Food for Peace or OFDA awards. Next slide, please. As we just talked about with the content focus areas are very complex, and there's still a lot to learn, and it's not well understood under each one. So my personal recommendation would just be to focus your learnings around one content focus area. We give you the flexibility to focus on one or two, and we know that content focus areas are intrinsically tied into most projects. But if you're really going to generate substantive knowledge that can push the needle forward, as we say, in my opinion, it's probably best just to target one. Next slide, please. Dissemination is something that's actually not called out in the concept note scoring criteria. That's going to be a focus of the full application, but is important for you to remember as you're planning your project and as you're thinking of your budget. What is going to be the costs of dissemination, and what is that initial budget that you put into the concept note? The goal of these awards is not just to create knowledge and learnings that are going to sit on a computer or sit on a shelf in your organization, but we want implementers to incorporate dissemination and try to facilitate better application of these awards amongst the food and nutrition security community. So do keep dissemination in mind as you're developing your concept note. Next slide, please. And then lastly, to leave you is, always word of advice for any people applying for a grant is to watch out for those capital assets and those other restrictions that you'll find called out in section B2. For capital asset definition, we look at the Code of Federal Regulations, and capital assets mean tangible or intangible assets used in operations having a useful life more than 1 year, which are capitalized in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. So just some common examples of capital assets would be things like land, buildings, equipment, and intellectual property. So this includes updating, replacing, modifying, altering of those capital assets, such as you're going to build something on the land, or if you're going to update a building. Those would all be considered as part of capital assets. Under the microgrants and the Program Improvement Awards, award funding cannot be used to purchase capital assets. The only exceptions are two. The exceptions is for equipment, which is cumulatively less than $5,000. And for the purchase of software, which is required to achieve the overall goals of your project. The other restriction I want to call out and mention in B2 is restriction on agricultural commodities, motor vehicles, pharmaceuticals, pesticides, used equipment, U.S. government-owned excess property, and fertilizers. So most of you will know these are the standard USAID regulations for things that are, we just can't purchase or have excess rules over. And unfortunately, due to a slowdown in the U.S. Activity Award, the projects cannot be, these expenses cannot be included in your budget. So please take that in note. I know it's a temptation when you see a food security project. We want to buy seeds, we want to buy fertilizer and do a project garden. Unfortunately, that cannot be funded through these learning awards. And then lastly, we're really excited that small grants can be part of larger Food for Peace programs, such as ongoing emergency food security projects or DFSAs, Development Food Security Activities. But we do want to be clear that this RFA is not intended to solicit applications for research work done by DFSAs during the refine and implement period. For those of you who are involved in DFSAs, you know the refine and implement year, and you'll know what I'm talking about. But we are not intending these to be used during that period because they already have an assigned budget for research during that period of time. So now I'd like to open it up to go into the question and answer session. We got about a little over 20 minutes left, and I think some questions are already getting started. So I'm going to pass it over to Kim to moderate.
Thank you so much, Austin. And thank you so much to all of our presenters for talking during today's webinar. We have a lot of great questions coming into the Q&A box. Just to reiterate, if you have any questions about anything that was discussed during today's webinar, we highly encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box. If we do not get to your question by the end of today's webinar, don't worry. We will be collecting all of your questions, and then we will be sending out a Q&A document to all registrants at the end of the webinar, probably early this week. So to tackle our first question, someone had asked, can the same idea be submitted to both microgrants and PIA, but with differences in scale? So Austin, I'm going to hand this one over to you.
So that's a really interesting thought. I don't think we specifically listed it on the RFA that is a restriction, but from my point of view, I would recommend not doing this. If it was rejected from a microgrant, most likely the same thing is going to happen in the Program Improvement Award. Scale is not the reason for rejection. If it's usually around the idea and its relation to a content focus area and what we're trying to achieve. So for the purposes, if you had applied for a microgrant, it's technically not prohibited, but I would ask that you not do that and just focus on one or the other. Again, it is making that decision, as we talked about in the early slide, is this project better for a microgrant or is it better for a Program Improvement Award, and sticking with that.
Great, and a similar question to the one that someone else just posed. Can an organization apply for both a microgrant and PIA? If doing so, will it hamper competitiveness if they apply for both?
Assuming there are different project ideas, by all means, you can apply for both a microgrant and a Program Improvement Award. There's no restriction on applying for those at this time. We are keeping these RFAs broad. In the future, we might do more targeted RFAs and set more restrictions on which you can apply for or what specific content focus area you can apply for. But at this stage, we are allowing, if you apply for a microgrant, you can apply for a Program Improvement Award with a different project proposal.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question. Their question is there a difference in geographical reach in either microgrant or PIA? So I think what this question is asking is the PIA meant to be more broad in its scope or geographical reach, or is it meant to be focused on a specific program?
No, we believe they have the same broad reach for geographical scope and where projects can be implemented. Again, the lessons and knowledge that's generated should be applicable to Food for Peace implementing countries and Food for Peace implementing partners. A lot of that work is done in Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, but also in Latin America. And we feel like making sure the learnings, even if you're going to do a project in the United States, which is going to gather information from a whole variety of different other countries, the learnings just need to be applicable for the Food for Peace target populations that they want to work with, which are those food insecure communities.
Great, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions coming into the Q&A box. Thank you
boy.
so much for your participation, everyone. Again, just to reiterate, if we don't get to your question by the end of the webinar, there will be a Q&A document and it will be circulated after the webinar. Another question that we have, again, for you, Austin, is can you confirm that the PIA, RFA, their idea does not have to be attached to an existing FFP project, or, you know, for example, if they want to partner with WFP, is that okay?
Yes, it does not need to be, the project idea does not need to be attached with a current Food for Peace program or OFDA program or any specific type of program. If you look in our eligibility, it is not connected with one of those. We do look for the project idea to be relating back to the Food for Peace learning agenda and strategy, as we mentioned before, but for actual implementation of the project, it's not required to be connected with a Food for Peace or a USAID funded project.
Great. And then there are a couple questions just actually about the microgrant process and the deadlines. Could you, Austin, please reiterate the microgrant timeline and when you think organizations might be awarded microgrants?
Good questions. So we had the first deadline, let's see, was the end of August, I believe the 28th. So we're currently going through the process of reviewing those now with our technical reviewers. Some, for those that have been screened and are not eligible, you should be expecting emails soon. If you haven't heard anything yet, that's probably a good sign, meaning we're moving forward with your application and taking it to the next step in the review process. We're hoping that everyone will be hearing back either with a rejection or with an issues letter asking some more detailed questions to help us confirm your final score and how we move it forward. I would target that, let's see, conservatively by mid-October, so 18th or 21st. The applications are with our reviewers now, so I'm ambitious and hoping that you'll be hearing sometime then that week of October 21st with an update if you don't hear sooner. I think the award timeline, we had talked about 3 to 4 months as the total award timeline. Because this is the very first RFA we released under IDEAL, we've got a new set of technical reviewers and experts that are involved. The process is understandably takes a little bit longer than it would for a well-refined process under TOPS, which had multiple years to do that. So I would think it would still be, probably more on the 4 months, 5 months timeline before a final agreement would be met, and we have Food for Peace recommendations. The process does require Food for Peace to sign off on the ones that we have vetted and approved and are recommending. So that also can take some time. So unfortunately, I can't give you a real hard deadline on that, but when issue letters are submitted, we'll try to give you an updated time frame.
Great. Very similar to that question, possibly from the same person, is that will there be later rounds of microgrants and PIAs, given that maybe you'll be expecting more applications than you thought you would receive? Given that, do you feel like there would be later rounds of microgrants or PIAs, or are the deadlines that you previously mentioned, are they pretty much set?
The deadlines in the published RFA are pretty much set at this point. We haven't had any internal conversations about changing anything on the published RFAs, but we do plan to release other RFAs in the future for future microgrants and for future program improvement awards. Those would be in 2020, 2021. We may do some of those a little bit more targeted. We want to see what kinds of project ideas are coming in, and if certain content focus areas aren't getting a lot of applications and we're not being able to really generate knowledge around them, maybe we'll do a more targeted RFA for microgrants on one of those content focus areas. So there will be other opportunities, but the next ones would be, and future rounds would be through future RFAs in 2020 or 2021.
Great, thank you so much. Again, if you guys have questions, please continue putting them in the Q&A box. We still have a couple more to go. This one is from Julie. Julie says that they are a multi-country, 26-country international development and disaster relief organization and would like to apply for a program improvement award. Are there any restrictions to multi-country proposals? And if yes, what they might be? Again, if they are currently not working with a FFP implementing partner, are they eligible? And can they work in a country where there is not an active FFP presence?
So yes, we would accept multi-country proposals. I believe we've received some for the microgrants. We know that some people are implementing in a variety of countries, and you want to bring all those learnings together and create something that can be more broadly used. And even if those projects, or excuse me, those countries are not Food for Peace areas, that is still perfectly fine. We still know there's a lot that can be learned from areas that are not Food for Peace targets for current implementation.
Great, thank you
Kim,
so much.
Does that answer the full question?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
I know there were a lot of parts to that one, but yes. And just to reiterate what we've been talking about, we have a question for a person that I think maybe missed the beginning of this webinar or did not attend the previous microgrant webinar. Austin, can you please reiterate the differences between Program Improvement Award and the microgrants, and kind of the differences and what these two awards could be used for?
All right. For the sake of time, I'm not sure I'm going to go into the full detail of that. We will have this recording posted very soon, and that's going to be up on the website. That's going to be shared within the next day. Some of the high-level differences that we talked about were obviously scope and what can be accomplished, and the different project types that you can look at. For the microgrants, we had targeted things like tool development and knowledge exchange, but with $100,000, we're opening that more up to pilot programs, different evaluations, training of trainers curriculum. So there's a different scale of different types of projects and investigative tools you can use to develop learning. Also with the $100,000 award, you can expect that there will be more restrictions, more challenges that kind of come along with accounting for those. First and foremost comes from having a cost reimbursable award. Your organization will need to have the capacity to properly account for everything that's spent and ensure those meet USAID rules and regulations. So it is a capacity aspect, I think, with the larger award, making sure you can submit those quarterly financial reports as well as quarterly reports with monitoring outcomes, with updates on your work plan, and really produce things that are going to align with the Food for Peace learning agenda and the Food for Peace strategy. So being familiar with those documents is another requirement that was not included in the microgrant. Just for the sake of time, I would highly recommend looking back at those slides. You'll have everything's recorded, so you'll get to hear me then.
Great, thank you so much. Another question we have is, can an organization submit multiple concept notes in response to the RFA, different projects in different countries?
Yes, they can submit multiple concept notes for multiple projects and, for different projects in different countries. Correct.
Great. And we had a couple of questions. During the registration, we had asked everyone to submit questions that they would like answered during the webinar. One of these questions is, can a small privately owned agribusiness serving smallholder farmers apply for this grant, or is this PIA only meant for NGOs or researchers?
No, and we do allow for for-profit organizations to apply as well, and are excited. We have had some for-profit organizations apply for microgrants, so I believe the agribusiness would be eligible to apply.
Great. And coming up on the last two questions being received by attendees. Again, if anyone has any other questions, we still have a couple of minutes, so please submit your questions to the Q&A box. One of the questions that we received in the registration for this webinar is specifically about the formatting of the application and concept notes, specifically the font and the formatting for those application materials. Austin, can you talk about the formatting and the font of the application materials and any instructions that you want to emphasize for those?
Yeah, I believe I remember seeing that question. The area of confusion was really around the font, the Ubuntu font, which is not a common font that's in all Word programs. What we recommend here is actually just typing into the Word document. Since we've used Ubuntu font in the template, if you start typing in there, you will also be able to use Ubuntu font. You can also use the format copy function. So if you want to paste in new text, you can reformat it and use the Ubuntu font inside of there. If there's an interest in actually downloading the Ubuntu font, just to make it easier on yourself, that can be arranged as well. We can send out the link to the Ubuntu font for downloads, but the download should not be necessary. If you're typing into the text, into the template that we've shared, you'll be able to use the font.
Great, thank you so much. So one last question before we end today's webinar. An attendee asks, is there a preference given to researchers for this PIA, specifically from the Global South or projects being located in the Global South? So two-part answer. Are there preferences given to researchers for this RFA? And also, is there a preference being given to the Global South or projects located in the Global South?
Good question. For the first question around researchers, at this time, there's not a preference given to researchers in particular. We do invite them to apply and hope there will be collaboration between researchers and nonprofit organizations and the larger community. Similarly, through the current scoring criteria, there is not a preference for organizations or researchers in the global south, but that is something we are thinking about and have in our minds for the potential research awards in 2020, because we do want to encourage that. We do hope to see many applications, and perhaps a preference to that will help us bring those forward. So definitely something we'll keep on our mind, and I appreciate you bringing that up as we're drafting these research awards.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who submitted their questions. This was a very engaged webinar, and we appreciate everyone's active engagement. This ends today's Q&A session. We will be posting an evaluation in the chat box. We would love to hear from you, and we would love to hear your feedback on this webinar and all of the info that was presented. So if you could please fill out that evaluation, it'd be very much appreciated. One final request that we got from an attendee is if we could send out the link for the Ubuntu font, because it would make it much easier for applicants to write out their concept notes and proposals ahead of time. That makes total sense. In the documents that we will be sending out after this webinar, we will include the links to download the Ubuntu font, and people can download that font if they feel like it would be easiest for them. Along with the Ubuntu font, we will also be sending out the webinar recording. We will be sending out the webinar PowerPoint slides, and also a document with all of your questions and answers, so that if you know of colleagues who did not attend this webinar and you would like to send them all of those materials, you can absolutely do so. So please, before you leave today's webinar, please fill out our evaluation. It would be much appreciated. And thank you so much for attending. And thank you so much to our presenters for this great webinar.